On the dusty main street of a small western town, James Miller held out a small pouch of coins, sealing a pact that silenced everyone around. Thomas Brown, drunk and staggering, accepted the money with trembling fingers, selling the very blood of his life, his daughter Emily. The girl kept her eyes fixed on the ground, and her silence weighed more than the sound of 100 gunshots on a Sunday afternoon. In the saloon doorway, rough men whispered that James was a fool, paying silver for a child no one believed could even hear. Women hid behind lace curtains, murmuring that such silence was a curse, a punishment from heaven itself. The sheriff, Ethan Walker, stood watch from his porch, one hand near his holster, suspecting that this deal carried storms yet unseen. James was no stranger to hardship, a man carved by sun and barbed wire, yet the weight of Emily's silence cut deeper than any scar. The sound of coins hitting the drunkard's palm echoed like cracked bells, announcing that innocence itself now had a price. Children peeked between fence posts, whispering if the girl would ever speak, or if she was destined to remain a ghost of sound. The red sunset bathed the town in a glow that looked like judgment, as though the very sky condemned what it saw. James placed a steady hand on Emily's shoulder, silently swearing that her silence would no longer be her only shield. The crowd held their breath, as if the groan of wooden boards beneath James's boots might break the fragile spell of that moment. Thomas laughed a bitter laugh, but even whiskey couldn't drown the shame of selling his own blood to another man. The church bell rang late, its toll heavy, as if heaven itself hesitated before acknowledging what had been done. And so, under a burning western sky, the town realized it had witnessed not just a transaction, but the opening of a story that would change them all. James Miller walked beside Emily, his heavy boots echoing against the dusty boards of the street as every eye followed them. The weight of the missing coins in his pocket did not cut as deeply as the silence of the girl who would not raise her eyes. The weather-beaten wooden buildings seemed to lean forward like silent witnesses, recording every second of the exchange. Women whispered behind cracked shutters, saying James had gone mad buying a child who could never hear his words. Men with wide-brimmed hats spat tobacco into the dirt, disguising fear with contempt, yet watching closely nonetheless. Emily's steps were slow and cautious, her gaze fixed on the ground, as though dust itself carried more comfort than people. James felt anger and pity twist inside him, recalling the cold nights of his own youth when he too had been treated as nothing. The desert wind cut across his scarred face, carrying the warning that secrets never stay buried, not even in the West. From the small church tower, bells tolled late, their uneven chimes sounding more like judgment than ritual. Children leaned from fence rails, whispering if she would ever speak, their curiosity mingling with fear like wildfire smoke. James knew no silence was complete, that behind every hush there hides echoes waiting to break loose. The sun, sinking in the horizon, stretched their shadows across the town like black scars carved into the dirt. Emily clutched her hands tight to her chest, shrinking inward as if storms lived under her skin waiting to erupt. Sheriff Ethan Walker lingered on the porch, his calculating eyes measuring every gesture, waiting for the truth beneath the silence. Drunken voices from the saloon mocked James, laughing about buying a burden heavier than any mule on the ranch. But in their laughter trembled unease, for even fools sensed that burdens sometimes carried fire hidden beneath cloth. James stopped at his ranch door, boots thudding against the boards, feeling as though he had crossed an invisible threshold. Emily froze at the doorway, hesitating to enter, torn between fear of prison and hope of sanctuary. James breathed deep, promising patience, even if he had to wait a lifetime for the girl to trust him. Above them, stars began piercing the fading sky, silent witnesses to a vow made without a single spoken word. The next morning, James rose before dawn as always, the smell of fresh coffee filling the wooden kitchen with warmth. Emily sat in the corner, staring at the steam rising from her cup, refusing to touch the bread he had placed for her. Her silence was so thick, James felt it could be sliced with the edge of his old ranch knife. Outside, the cattle lowed restlessly, and the groan of the gate reminded him that life pressed forward despite broken hearts. James studied her discreetly, searching for signs in her vacant stare, wondering if it was fear, grief, or something deeper. She never fully raised her eyes, yet every small movement suggested a will locked tightly inside. Slowly, James noticed she reacted to his footsteps, to the scrape of a chair, to the faint ring of a spoon. Each reaction stirred suspicion in him, a spark suggesting the girl was not truly deaf, as all believed. Meanwhile, gossip thickened in town. They said James had bought a curse, not redemption, and doom would follow. Some swore Emily was cursed, others whispered she was mute by choice, but all agreed nothing good could come of it. The sun climbed, baking the ranch, turning the wood into a furnace where truths cracked like dried clay. Emily bit her lip whenever James tried to speak to her, holding back words locked behind invisible bars. He did not press her, yet every silence seemed like a distant lantern, promising revelations not yet ready to shine. That afternoon he led her into the barn, and her eyes brightened at the sight of horses, a spark of hidden life. James ran his calloused hands along a saddle, and she followed his every move with quiet, careful attention. The wind carried the scent of distant rain, and Emily tilted her face upward as if greeting the living world. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, but to James it was like a flash of hope in endless darkness. Back in town, wagers were made that she would never speak, laughter masking fear of the unknown. James, however, saw in her silence not emptiness, but the weight of something greater than words. He promised himself that when her silence broke, it would change everything and force the world to listen. The days passed under a merciless sun, dust clinging to skin and sweat, carving paths down weathered faces. Emily took on small chores, always silent, moving with careful precision as though her life depended on stillness. James observed the subtle ways she reacted to barking dogs, a dropped bucket, the clatter of the dinner bell. Each reaction confirmed his suspicion, a fire building slowly within him like coals waiting for wind. In town, gossip multiplied. Even the preacher muttered that the girl carried an ancient curse upon her. James ignored the whispers, though he knew fear spreads faster than prairie fire and could consume even the innocent. Emily showed glimmers of trust, accepting food without hesitation, walking by his side down to the river. But her silence lingered like a ghost, a mystery that even time refused to erode. At night, James sometimes heard soft footsteps across the floorboards, finding Emily staring silently at the moon. It was as if she waited for something, guarding a secret so heavy it denied her sleep. The stars gleamed above, and James sensed her mystery was greater than even the vast western sky. Sheriff Ethan visited on patrol and noticed what James had. The girl did not move like one who was deaf. "She hears more than she lets on," Ethan muttered, his suspicion tightening the knot in James's chest. James kept the thought to himself, but it haunted him through every chore, every sunrise and sunset. Emily's eyes carried riddles, each glance like a cipher no man could yet decode. The town began treating her like a ghost, present yet untouchable, as though she were made of wind. At the market, women avoided her presence, whispering that her silence might be a disease of the soul. To James, however, her silence no longer felt like fear. It felt like promise, a storm bound to break. And with each day, he became more convinced that once the secret emerged, nothing in town would ever remain the same. Thus, in heat and dust, James's ranch grew into the stage for a story no one could yet imagine its ending. One hot afternoon, James brought Emily back into town, and every eye turned to watch them as if judgment itself rode with them. People stepped aside, uneasy, as though the girl carried some invisible plague that might spread with a glance. From the corner of the saloon, Thomas Brown, drunker than ever, laughed loud enough to rattle glass bottles on the counter. "Good luck with that useless burden," he shouted before collapsing into his own whiskey-stained shirt. Emily hunched her shoulders, silent still, but the weight of her quiet drowned out even her father's bitter laughter. Sheriff Ethan Walker narrowed his eyes, watching carefully, certain that more was hidden here than idle gossip. James held his head high, his hand gripping Emily's shoulder firmly, a silent vow of protection against every insult. The air carried a tension thicker than storm clouds, each second stretching like a rope pulled too tight. Windows creaked open, women peered out, their eyes reflecting fear and pity mixed into one uncertain gaze. Emily's fingers trembled though she said nothing, betraying the storm bottled inside her chest. Children whispered, asking why she never spoke, and if her silence was punishment from God or a spell of the devil. An old preacher sitting by the church muttered that truths buried too long always rise like restless spirits. James's stride grew heavier with each step, each boot thud defying the crowd that wanted him to falter. That day, it became clear the girl's silence was no longer just her own. It had become the town's burden too. Dust swirled across Main Street, forming small whirlwinds that looked like omens in the setting sun. Emily kept her gaze lowered, but James sensed the time would come when the world would hear what she had hidden. Sheriff Ethan whispered under his breath, "That silence is dynamite waiting for a spark." The words carried across the street like prophecy, striking unease into the hearts of men hardened by the frontier. James and Emily returned to the ranch, but the town felt the shift in the wind, knowing nothing would stay the same. From that day on, everyone braced for the moment when silence would finally explode into truth. Nights at the ranch grew restless, as Emily seemed to carry within her a secret too heavy to remain unspoken forever. She often rose in the dark, standing by the window, staring at the moon, as if waiting for its silver light to answer. James watched quietly, respecting the mystery, though his chest burned with questions he dared not voice. The groan of wooden floorboards echoed like warnings, reminding him that secrets are not buried, only delayed. The cattle moaned at night, the dogs barked without cause, and even the horses stomped nervously as though sensing trouble. Emily never smiled, yet sometimes her lips trembled as if holding back words desperate to escape. James noticed again how she turned her head when the wind whistled, how her body tensed at sounds she should never hear. Each sign stoked his suspicion, building certainty that her silence was chosen, not forced by nature. In town, rumors grew uglier, claiming James harbored danger inside his own house. Others whispered Emily was an omen, her silence a curse meant to draw violence to the town. Sheriff Ethan began visiting more often, circling the ranch with watchful eyes, though he said little. Emily remained unchanged on the surface, giving nothing away but glances sharp enough to carve stone. James lay awake wondering if he would ever hear her voice or die, never knowing the truth she carried. Deep down, he feared the day it finally came, for no secret that heavy breaks without shattering lives. The cold night wind whistled through cracks in the house, as if reminding him that truth is always searching for a door. Emily stood at the doorway one evening, watching the horizon with the stillness of someone who hears voices in the wind. James crossed his arms, knowing he could not force her, yet fearing the day the silence would break on its own. They lived like survivors of a war no one else could see, carrying scars without battles. The frontier seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment her truth would tear through the quiet. And James understood that when it came, There would be no turning back, only fire and consequence. It was on a blood-red afternoon, the kind that feels like judgment, when the first crack in silence appeared. James had taken Emily back into town, and once again people stopped and stared as if witnessing an omen unfold. Thomas Brown stumbled into the street, his face twisted, shouting curses that reeked of whiskey and shame. "She's mine!" he screamed, though his steps faltered and his fists shook like brittle wood. James stepped forward, solid as stone, placing himself between Emily and the broken man who had sold her. The sun burned low, heat rippling in the air as if destiny itself had been set aflame. Women pulled children back into doorways, while Sheriff Ethan moved closer, hand hovering over his revolver. Emily's chest rose and fell, faster now, her eyes fixed on her father with a mixture of fear and defiance. Thomas spat, declaring no man could take from him what he had already traded, his rage hollow and pitiful. James's stare silenced him more than words, forcing Thomas to stumble back a step. Dust rose in a sudden gust of wind, turning the street into a painted canvas of chaos and fate. Emily clenched her fists, and in her eyes shone a storm held too long, ready to burst free. Then came the impossible. Her lips parted, a sound caught between fear and fire, trembling on the edge of release. The town froze, every breath held, because no one believed the girl could speak at all. Thomas's curses grew weaker, drowned by the power building in the child's fragile frame. James felt his heart jolt, sensing the world was about to change in the space of a single breath. Sheriff Ethan stood motionless, like a man waiting for the trigger of destiny to be pulled. The silence became absolute, broken only by the pounding of hearts in chests, unprepared for truth. Emily opened her mouth again, and the weight of years pressed forward, ready to shatter. And at that moment, the entire town realized that silence itself was about to end forever. Emily drew a deep breath, her lips trembling like an old door finally ready to swing open after years of silence. Her voice came rough at first, but clear enough to slice through the dusty air and lodge itself into every heart listening. "I've always heard everything," she said, and the words dropped like iron horseshoes onto the ground, echoing louder than gunfire. Gasps rippled through the crowd, disbelief cutting across faces like a knife, shattering the comfort of long-held lies. She revealed she had stayed silent only to survive, knowing her father's cruelty fed on her every word. James felt the cold of realization crawl up his spine, for her silence carried the weight of the town's cowardice. Sheriff Ethan lowered his chin in respect, acknowledging the bravery hidden in the girl's small frame. Thomas staggered backward, stunned, as though caught in his own trap, his curse dissolving into hollow stutters. Emily lifted her eyes to the horizon, her gaze blazing with defiance, no longer the look of a broken child. She spoke of overheard plans whispered in the saloon, schemes to rob, burn, and frame innocent ranchers. She named Jacob and Miles, laying their sins bare in the open street, each syllable a bullet hitting its mark. Women at windows covered their mouths, men pulled hats low, and the town's false peace cracked like dry wood. James, steady beside her, felt the burden shift. Her words had become justice, not just survival. And in that instant, the visual climax unfolded. James towering in silent resolve, Emily blazing with truth, Thomas cowering in shame. The sheriff stood like a sentinel, torn between duty and awe, the red sun painting judgment across his face. Dust swirled around them, framing the scene as if the land itself had decided to remember forever. Horses froze mid-step, doors hung half open. Even the wind seemed to bow to the moment. Those who saw it swore the child glowed with the storm of 1,000 truths unleashed at once. Sheriff Ethan finally whispered, "The fuse has been lit," knowing the girl's voice would set fire to everything. From that day forward, her silence became legend, her voice a force that no man dared doubt again. Thomas tried to lunge forward, but his drunken body betrayed him, stumbling with the weight of his own shame. James blocked him without a word, his stance a wall of flesh and bone, declaring the girl untouchable. Emily did not flinch, her voice steady now, as if once freed it had no intention of hiding again. She described how Thomas and the outlaws planned to torch barns, steal cattle, and frame neighbors for their crimes. She remembered nights where whispers turned to vows, where men plotted by lamplight while she listened unseen. The crowd stirred, anger boiling as familiar names cut through their denial, forcing them to confront the truth. Sheriff Ethan ordered silence, demanding everyone stay to hear, for the law now rested on the girl's words. James nodded, his grip steady on her shoulder, proud that her silence had become a compass pointing straight at justice. Thomas spat denials, but the stench of whiskey on his breath weakened every excuse he tried to muster. Grace, the shopkeeper's wife, stepped forward, confessing she too had seen Jacob and Miles sneaking out late at night. A young errand boy admitted he overheard drunken boasts of framing ranches and burning property for distraction. The saloon grew tense, even with its doors wide open, walls bending under the weight of guilt, spilling into the street. Sheriff Ethan ordered Thomas taken to the jailhouse before mob fury replaced justice with bloodlust. James stayed with Emily, the weight of his hand on her shoulder as unshakable as a judge's gavel. Emily breathed steadier, confessing she had stayed quiet, not because she was weak, but because she waited for her moment. The crowd fell silent, shamed by the realization that their ignorance had been complicity. The copper sun smeared across the horizon like a stamp of destiny, branding the town with guilt. Some men tried to slink away, but deputies had already sealed off the street, forcing them to face the truth. Tears welled in Emily's eyes, not from fear, but from the release of carrying her secret no longer alone. Just then, the thunder of hooves echoed from beyond the ridge, promising more shadows yet to come. 3 riders appeared on the horizon, their silhouettes black against the fiery sky, hooves striking rhythm like war drums. James recognized Miles by his tattered coat, and dread settled as he realized Emily's words had traveled faster than the wind. Sheriff Ethan placed deputies strategically, turning Main Street into a battlefield disguised as a stage. Windows slammed shut, doors latched tight, the town holding its breath like a single terrified body. Emily stood tall in the center of it all, a living reminder that truth once spoken could never be caged again. From the jailhouse, Thomas screamed incoherently, his voice no longer more than a shadow of guilt. Miles dismounted with false calm, eyes scanning the crowd as though weighing exits and weaknesses. He claimed they were travelers seeking rest, but sweat betrayed him, dripping like guilt in the open sun. James did not answer, his silence now stronger than any threat, a wall against the lies of desperate men. Emily repeated her accusations, every name, every plan, every whispered betrayal spoken with unflinching precision. Each word nailed shut the coffin of their deceit, burying denial beneath the weight of memory. Sheriff Ethan demanded they surrender weapons and face questioning, but men who thrive in darkness rarely welcome the light. Miles smirked, his golden tooth catching the last beam of sun, a warning as sharp as drawn steel. The men behind him shifted, nerves unraveling, hands brushing their holsters as if impatience could save them. Mothers gathered their children close, dogs whined. Even the breeze seemed too cautious to stir the dust. James stepped in front of Emily, his frame declaring her untouchable, his silence a loaded gun. The sheriff rested his hand gently on his revolver, balancing law against the crackling edge of violence. Emily's voice rose above the stillness, recounting plans of fire and theft meant to cripple the town before dawn. Her words stripped the men bare, their faces twisting, their lies drying like mud in the sun. And then, from the ridge behind, a 4th rider appeared, carrying with him the weight of revelations yet untold. The 4th rider dismounted slowly, the creak of leather echoing across the hushed street like a warning from fate itself. It was Caleb, once an outlaw, known for leaving the gang after a duel that nearly ended his life on a cold desert night. Eyes turned to him with dread and curiosity, for his return meant secrets ran deeper than the town had imagined. Emily stiffened, recognizing his voice from those saloon nights where plans were whispered in the dark. Her finger pointed at him, her words steady, calling out that he too had schemed to bring ruin to innocent neighbors. The sheriff's hand tightened on his revolver, torn between hope Caleb had changed and fear he came to silence the truth. James held firm beside Emily, reading the shame etched into the lines of the man's weary face. Caleb did not meet anyone's eyes, instead staring at the dirt, as though it held the grave he had long prepared. "She knows everything," he muttered, and his voice cracked with the weight of sins carried too far. Emily's courage did not falter, her defiance burning brighter now that her secret had broken into daylight. She named dates, places, promises made in whiskey-soaked corners where Caleb had once sworn loyalty to betrayal. The crowd reeled, shifting uneasily, anger sparking like tinder catching in the wind. Mills tried to laugh it off, but the sound broke like glass, revealing the fear trembling beneath his grin. Sheriff Ethan's voice cut through, commanding Caleb to confess or deny, for the town would hear the truth this day. The outlaw drew a long breath, eyes glistening with regret, and admitted that Emily spoke nothing but truth. The crowd erupted, some demanding punishment, others pausing to weigh whether redemption was possible. James studied him closely, seeing not just guilt, but a man torn between damnation and salvation. Emily's eyes did not blink, carrying the force of a storm that no man could outrun. Tears welled in Caleb's eyes as the wind swept dust around him, cloaking his confession in sorrow. And the town realized her broken silence revealed not just crimes, but the rot festering in the soul of men. Caleb's admission split the crowd like a canyon, voices rising, torn between fury and fragile mercy. Sheriff Ethan, seasoned in frontier justice, knew haste would only birth more blood, but delay could ignite chaos. James raised his voice with uncommon force, declaring Emily had saved the town from ruin greater than anyone imagined. Women, once hidden behind curtains, stepped boldly into the street, faces hardened with long-buried courage. An aging blacksmith admitted he too had heard rumors of plots, but lacked the strength to confront armed men. Emily's testimony showed them all that silence had been their true jailer, fear their heaviest chain. She described the smell of powder clinging to Miles's coat, the clink of dirty coins pocketed by Caleb, the vows of fire sworn in shadows. Every detail she gave shattered denial, turning the town into an unwilling courtroom beneath the open sky. From the jailhouse, Thomas raged, spitting that his daughter lied, but his drunken cries rang hollow. No one listened anymore, for Emily's truth carried the weight of innocence lost and courage reclaimed. Sheriff Ethan ordered Jacob and Miles seized, their protest drowned by the crowd's furious roar. Caleb was placed under guard, not condemned yet, for his confession gave him one thread of redemption. The people argued, some calling for ropes, others pleading for judgment tempered by fairness. James stood steady, his arm over Emily, proud that her voice carried more strength than any gun he owned. The horizon glowed red with sunset, the land itself etched with fire as though bearing witness to the trial. Cattle lowed uneasily, dogs howled, the entire frontier trembling beneath the weight of what had been confessed. Emily raised her chin, her words like hammer blows, vowing she would never again let silence cage her. The crowd hushed, tears brimming in eyes too hardened by years of fear, moved by a child's defiance. Sheriff Ethan allowed himself a rare smile, knowing justice could only stand when built on truth, not bullets. James felt a swell of pride, realizing that saving her life had led her to save the town's very soul. That night, the town could not sleep, for Emily's words still echoed in every corner, like bells none could silence. Houses creaked beneath the weight of guilt. Men who once boasted now trembled in shame. At the ranch, James watched over Emily, not as guardian, but as ally, knowing her strength exceeded even his. Emily lay awake in her small room, staring at the wooden beams, smiling faintly for the first time in years. The burden of silence lifted slowly, like ice thawing under the relentless desert sun. Sheriff Ethan filled pages with notes, determined to preserve every detail of the night that changed everything. Thomas, sobering in his cell, wept bitterly, realizing the daughter he had discarded carried courage greater than his own. Caleb sat alone, haunted by his confession, praying there was still a path to rebuild the ruins of his soul. Neighbors gathered in clusters, debating what justice should look like now that truth had finally come. The wind swept through empty streets, scattering dust like memories too heavy to stay settled. Emily dreamed lightly, hearing voices not of fear, but of strength. Her silence transformed into power. James sat on the porch, gazing at the stars, knowing it was not he who had saved her, but she who had saved them all. The cattle lowed softly, dogs rested, the ranch breathing with a rhythm it had never known before. In town, shadows lingered, men who thrived on lies plotting how to strike back. The girl's broken silence had reshaped destiny, but it had also stirred enemies unwilling to surrender control. Even in triumph, the air carried warning that victory on the frontier is never final. The stars burned bright, promising hope, but whispering caution. Not all dust settles easily. Emily slept peacefully, unaware her voice had become both the greatest gift and the most dangerous target. James closed weary eyes, vowing to protect her truth until his last breath. And in that quiet night, fate wrote the next chapter, unseen but already alive in the hearts of all. Dawn broke differently that morning, not with dread, but with the fragile peace of a town reborn through truth. James rose early, standing on his porch as the first light painted the land, knowing yesterday had carved a scar into history. Emily stepped into the yard, the sun warming her face, her smile faint, yet stronger than the silence she once wore. James placed his hand gently on her shoulder, pride swelling in his chest at the strength she had shown. Sheriff Ethan arrived with news that Jacob and Miles were in custody, though whispers of vengeance still lingered beyond town. Emily listened without fear, her eyes steady, carrying the certainty of someone who had already survived the worst. By noon, the townsfolk gathered in the square, their voices hushed, their hearts heavy with shame and newfound resolve. Thomas, shackled in the jailhouse, kept his gaze low, unable to face the daughter he once traded for coins. Caleb, humbled, asked for forgiveness, his tears cutting paths through the dust on his weathered face. The church bells rang not for mourning, but for rebirth, echoing across the valley like a call to begin again. Emily lifted her voice for all to hear, declaring she would never again live in silence or fear. Her words landed like a judge's gavel, final and unshakable, binding the town to its own reckoning. Children smiled, elders sighed, and even the restless horses seemed to sense a burden lifting from the land. James, his eyes moist, realized that buying Emily had not been an act of charity, but of destiny fulfilled. Sheriff Ethan raised his hat, telling the people that law is nothing without the courage to confront darkness. Women clapped, men lowered their heads, the weight of their complicity settling heavy upon them. The West, known for its violence and blood, now bore witness to a story where truth carried the louder shot. A warm wind swept through Main Street, scattering the last remnants of fear into the horizon. Emily smiled in public for the first time, her face radiant with freedom, her voice now a beacon. And in that moment, the silence of one child transformed into the salvation of an entire town. The events of that day, proved that even in the harshest deserts, truth can bloom when someone dares to speak. Emily's pain became her power, teaching the world that silence, when broken, can thunder louder than any rifle shot. James learned that saving a life is worth more than cattle or land, for dignity is the only wealth that endures. Sheriff Ethan discovered that law without compassion is hollow, and true justice is born from courage, not fear. The town realized that fear is the worst prison, and turning away from injustice is the same as building its walls. Thomas bore the shame of knowing his daughter's strength eclipsed every false pride he had clung to in whiskey haze. Caleb's confession showed that even broken men can find redemption when they choose truth over the weight of lies. Emily proved that silence is not weakness when chosen for survival, but true strength is choosing the moment to speak. The Wild West, remembered for blood and dust, carried now a new memory, that hope can echo louder than violence. And we who hear this tale must remember, lives change when silence becomes voice, and truth refuses to be buried.